So the world just moved a few inches off its axis this week. The biggest trade deal of 2026 went through, and the United States, they weren't even in the room.
While Donald Trump was busy ranting about how Canada lives because of the USA, the rest of the planet was busy doing something he never saw coming: planning an economy that doesn't revolve around him.
India and the European Union, 2 billion people and a quarter of the world's economy, just shook hands on the mother of all deals, while the self-proclaimed deal maker in Washington was left fuming on the sidelines.
And Canada isn't just watching either. We're up next. While Trump threatens us with 100% tariffs, Prime Minister Carney is in the middle of a strategic pivot that puts our resources in the hands of allies, not bullies.
So today, we're exposing how the world is quietly moving on without the USA.
So while Trump is back home warning that China will take over Canada and threatening 100% tariffs if we dare trade with anyone he doesn't control, the rest of the world is doing the one thing he never planned for. They're building a system that goes around the USA.
We're talking EU-India, Canada-India, Canada-EU, targeted deals with China that put our farmers first and finally get us a slice of the EV market. And how Mark Carney, the stable Canadian banker, is suddenly the person other leaders are quoting.
So let's give a little backstory, because Canadians have been dealing with the fallout of Trump for a year. We've watched Trump lie about drugs and immigrants crossing the border from Canada. We've watched him destroy the very trade agreement that he made, and watched him slap tariffs on anything that moves.
Yeah, he called everybody freeloaders, he insulted NATO soldiers that sacrificed their lives in Afghanistan, and he told the world that Canada only exists because of the USA. Remember that, Mark.
In Trump's tiny mind, if you bully the world, they will fall in line. And for a while there, it looked like leaders did. People brought him gifts, they smiled for the cameras in the Oval Office, and they told him how great he was. But all the while, they were quietly making deals behind his back.
Proof in point, India and the EU started talking seriously again. Mexico and Canada tightened their own ties. Canada went looking for new buyers for canola and LNG. India started asking who could supply energy and uranium without turning every shipment into a political hostage. At the exact moment that Trump was sulking about Canada's trade deal with China and threatening 100% tariffs on us, India and the European Union were putting pen to paper on what they are literally calling the mother of all deals.
They signed a massive free trade agreement that slashes or eliminates tariffs on more than 90% of goods. That's cars, machinery, medicine heading to India with less friction. The textiles, seafood manufacturing, that's all heading to Europe on easier terms.
That saves European companies up to 4 billion euros a year in duties. That's a $27 trillion market deciding, you know what? We're not waiting around to see what mood the orange guy in the White House wakes up in today.
Now you've got the world's largest democracy on one side and a bloc of 27 countries on the other, finally locking in a pact that slashes or removes tariffs on the vast majority of what they trade. Companies on both sides can plan around a long-term framework instead of guessing what tomorrow's presidential outburst is going to be.
And that pressure didn't just push India toward Europe, it pushed them to look north too, because Canada and India were also quietly pulling their relationship out of the deep freeze.
Yeah, at the same time, India's High Commissioner here started giving interviews that sounded very different from the old days. For years, India saw Canada as an extension of Washington. If you wanted to move Ottawa, you lobbied the U.S. first.
And that's why Carney's upcoming trip to India in March matters so much. On the agenda, a 10-year uranium agreement worth around $2.8 billion, a big push on energy, and accelerated talks to massively expand overall trade.
Put that next to the EU-India deal and you can see the connection. One line between Europe and India, another line between India and Canada. Add in the links that we already have with Europe, and suddenly there's a triangle of democracies wiring themselves together at the exact moment the old everything goes through Washington model is falling apart.
All of this is happening with Davos as the backdrop, because that's where the story really took off. So let's talk about that for a second and what Carney actually did there. Because this wasn't just a spicy speech for Gander Social. At Davos, he laid out a strategy for what he calls middle powers. Canada, the EU, India, the kind of countries that aren't superpowers but absolutely are not bit players.
The core of it was simple. If the rules don't protect you anymore, you build new ones with people who actually want stability. You diversify your trade, your energy, your supply chains, and you do it together so nobody can be picked off one by one.
And that wasn't just a speech, it was a blueprint. While the U.S. tries to build a wall around itself, the rest of the world is building a bridge around the U.S. And the first major support beam of that bridge just snapped into place.
And that is exactly what's freaking out the White House right now, because they aren't just losing the trade war, they're losing the narrative. Enter Scott Bessent. He's the architect of the 3-3-3 plan, 3% growth, 3% deficit, and 3 million more barrels of oil a day. He's mad because he thought he was isolating India over Russian oil, and instead, he shoved them straight into the arms of Europe. And then there's the fairy tale Bessent tried to sell on Fox News. He told Hannity that he was in the Oval Office when Carney called and that the Canadian Prime Minister was aggressively walking back his Davos speech. He tried to make it sound like Carney was begging for mercy.
But you do have to see the footage from Parliament Hill yesterday. When reporters asked Carney if he'd apologize to Trump, he literally rolled his eyes at the camera.
He told the press, to be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos. He confirmed he told Trump that Canada is diversifying because there's almost nothing normal now in the United States.
And the irony here is brutal. The more the U.S. tries to punish everyone for diversifying, the more it proves why diversification is actually necessary. And that's the new game. Every time the White House uses tariffs as a weapon, somebody else says, cool story. We'll sign somewhere else, thanks.
Now zoom in on Canada and India because this is where Carney's strategy gets real for us. Right now, about 98% of our energy exports still go to the United States. Carney's own energy minister went to India's big energy conference this week and called that dependence a strategic blunder. Not a minor oversight, a blunder.
And he's not wrong. When one country buys almost all of your oil and gas, they don't just buy the barrels, they buy leverage over your jobs, your revenue, your politics. So Canada is finally saying, we're done being a one-customer shop.
India, on the other hand, is the opposite problem. Huge population, rising middle class, still industrializing and absolutely starved for energy. India is the next big engine for global oil demand, and they're importing around 5% of the world's liquefied national gas already.
Now put those two stories together and it's obvious. Canada's blunder is India's opportunity, and India's demand surge is Canada's insurance policy. Canadian crude can substitute a lot for the heavy oil that India currently buys from Iraq. And it's not just oil either. Our own exports are pointing to everything from naphtha, that's a key feedstock for petrochemicals if you're wondering, I know we were, to ethane, to LNG, to uranium. India's High Commissioner to Canada is literally out there saying, if you can sell it to us, we'll buy it. Minerals, critical minerals, fertilizer, potash, lumber, uranium, you name it, and that is not solved.
Under previous governments, Canada had the reputation in India of being the United States kid brother, slow, bureaucratic, and only really open for business if Washington gave the nod. Now the same envoy is saying, on the record, that under Carney's Canada, it is carving out a more independent role and moving faster on approvals and investment. That is a complete reputational flip in one term.
And it's about to get baked into policy. Carney's upcoming trip in March has everything on the table. That big uranium deal, long-term energy contract, and the kickoff to a comprehensive trade agreement that Indian officials say could be wrapped up in about a year if both sides keep their foot on the gas.
Now, if this was just Canada and India doing a side hustle, Washington could shrug it off. But it's not. This is part of a much bigger pattern that's starting to freak out the U.S. financial press.
Now let's look at the scoreboard here. The EU has raced through a string of deals. Mercosur in South America, an updated deal with Mexico, a fresh agreement with Indonesia, and now the India mega deal. They're restarting talks with Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, the UAE, even dusting off the Australia talks, all explicitly framed as a way to offset Trump's tariffs and reduce reliance on both the U.S. and China.
At the same time, you've got commentators openly talking about a kind of global trade organization. It's a club of countries that keep the old rules-based system alive among themselves while the U.S. does its own thing. It sounds academic until you look at the math, because a bloc like that without the U.S. would account for around 60% of world exports. America is only at about 10 to 12%, so it's a huge deal.
Which means if Canada, the EU, India, and the rest of that group coordinate, they don't need to scream back at Trump. They just quietly reroute investment, sign new trade agreements, and watch as companies shift production to wherever the tariffs aren't flying around like confetti.
Carney's Davos point was basically, if you aren't at the table, you're on the menu. So right now, he's making sure Canada has a seat at the India-EU middle power table instead of sitting in the hallway outside the Oval Office waiting for the door to open.
Meanwhile, what's Trump doing with the power in all of this? Well, he's using tariffs like a toddler uses glitter, throwing them at everyone and then acting surprised when they blow back in his face.
He's slapped punishing duties on Indian exports, including that 25% extra that he specifically tied to India's purchases of Russian oil. On top of the existing tariffs, that pushes the average rate up to 50%. Then he screamed that Europe was financing a war against itself by signing a deal with India anyway.
So now let's look at this from Delhi's point of view. On one side, you've got the U.S. hitting you with oil-related tariffs, lecturing you on who you're allowed to buy energy from and dragging you into their domestic politics. On the other side, you've got Europe saying, drop your card tariffs, let's cut duties on 90+% of goods, we'll build factories together, and we won't try to tell you how to vote. Shockingly, India picked door number 2.
Washington's pressure didn't even stop the EU-India deal. It actually sped it up. Both sides could see the window. Trump is weaponizing oil, sanctions, and tariffs, and nobody knows what he's going to do next. So Europe and India, they signed the deal while they could. And by the time the White House woke up, well, it was already too late to stop it.
That's exactly what we're seeing with Canada now. Carney's still negotiating Kuzma, well, because we're not idiots. We're not walking away from our biggest customer, obviously. But he's telling Canadians in public, there is nearly nothing normal in the U.S. right now.
And he's backing it up with actual deals on other continents, China, India, Europe, you name it. This year alone, he signed off or kicked off a dozen trade deals and investment deals. Food and EVs with China, defense and clean tech with Europe, energy and farm exports in the Gulf and Latin America, critical minerals with partners in Asia and Africa, and now this India package moving at full speed.
Now, stack on top of that, there's the MOUs on LNG, battery plans, grid upgrades, real plans, not just photo ops, all sending the same message. Canada isn't waiting around for the US to calm down. We're opening more doors so nobody can slam just one and scare us anymore.
That's the difference between a bully and a strategist. Trump thinks power is flipping off a worker at a Ford plant and threatening to nuke your neighbor's economy if they don't fall in line. Carney thinks power is building enough alternatives that when the bully starts flailing, you can shrug and say, who cares, we've got options.
So where does all this leave Canada? Well, it leaves us in a place we're not used to being, right? A pivot point. For decades, we told ourselves, we're just this small country that has to keep the Americans happy. Now we've got the EU asking us to help anchor a new trade architecture, India begging us for energy and critical minerals, and a prime minister who's actually willing to say it on the world stage, that the old bargain with Washington is over.
Our choice is pretty clear. We can either follow Trump down a path where tariffs and chaos run the show, or we can lean into being what Carney is trying to turn this into. A serious, reliable country that feeds people, powers economy, and helps hold together a new coalition of countries that are tired of being told that they're lucky to just be invited.
The United States we grew up with, the ally that understood mutual defense and shared sacrifice, is buried under a White House along with the East Wing. But the good news is, Canada is not a hostage in this story. We have leverage. We have resources. We have partners who actually want to work with us instead of shouting at us.
So the question for Canadians isn't what if Trump gets mad? He's already mad. The question is, are we going to keep acting like a baby brother to the USA economy, or are we finally ready to act like what India, Europe, and a lot of the world just told us we are? An independent country with something the rest of the planet actually needs.
And we want to hear from you, because if you're tired of the threats and ready for Canada that stands on its own 2 feet, then you need to be part of this conversation.
So hit that like button right now to tell the algorithm that Canadian sovereignty matters. And make sure to subscribe and click on that bell so you don't miss our deep dives tomorrow.
And if you want to go deeper, consider joining the A-Team. Our members get exclusive updates, and it helps us keep this channel 100% independent of that corporate spin.
So share this video with one person who thinks we're still trapped by Washington. And tell them we're not. It's a new world, it's a new day, and we need to be ready.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll see you tomorrow.